Welcome to Sociological Research Methods number 5. Today we're going to have a look at participant observations. Now there's two types of observations that we're going to look at over the next 2 weeks. This week we're going to focus on participant observations, whereas next time we're going to focus on non-participant observations. And the key difference here between the two is with participant observations, the researcher is actively joining in. They are participating with the group that they're observing. They are joining in with their lifestyle, getting involved, immersing themselves in the lifestyle and the culture of that group. And the whole point is they're trying to see the world through the group's eyes. They're trying to achieve what Weber calls Verstehen, a German word for kind of empathetic understanding. You really know what's going through the heads, what thoughts and meanings the group hold when you do participant observation and you achieve Verstehen. So this generally produces qualitative data. Now, non-participant observation, like the name suggests, you don't join in. You don't get involved. There's less focus on this Verstehen. It's more about simply observing the actions of the people that you're watching, the participants, and generally noting down the behavior. So again, this focuses more on the quantitative data and is answering the question kind of what happens, whereas participant observation is looking more at why people behave the way they do. So those are the two we're going to look at today. We're going to focus on participant observation. So let's get started with it. Now, both types of observation, participant and non-participant, can be done in two different ways. And these two different ways will affect the kind of strengths and weaknesses of each observation. They can either be done covertly, which means done undercover, done in secret, and the participants are unaware that they're being researched, or they can be done overtly, in an open and obvious way. And the participants know they're being researched, they're informed ahead of time, they know what's going on. Again, different strengths and weaknesses that match these different types of observations. So that's going to be a factor as we go through looking at the strengths and weaknesses and looking at the examples. You need to make a note of whether they were done covertly or overtly. And you could get asked specific exam questions on the kind of strengths and weaknesses of covert versus overt or the other way around. So it's important you understand the difference: covert, undercover, overt, open, obvious, and they know they're being researched. Now today I'm going to do things in a slightly different order. Normally I'd talk about all the different strengths and weaknesses and then give you the examples at the end. Today I'm going to do it the other way around, because I'm going to give you two examples, and then when we're going through the strengths and weaknesses, I'm going to give you some specifics and details from these guys' research to support the points that we're making, which is essentially what you need to do when you're writing your exam question. So the first guy I want you to be aware of is a guy called Donald McIntyre. He did a covert participant observation. They didn't know he was a researcher. Okay, and he was interested in football hooliganism. So he joined what was called the Chelsea Headhunters, which is the kind of Chelsea fan support gang, essentially, the football hooligans who are interested in essentially violence and fighting with the other football teams. Hooligans, each football team apparently has their own group of hooligans and organised fights, and so he wanted to join that for Chelsea. And he secretly filmed a lot of the interactions with some of these Chelsea headhunters. He pretended to be a drug dealer to kind of get into the group and joined in with many of the activities of the gang, including violence. Now, on the other hand, we've got this guy Venkatesh, who did overt participant observation. He basically started asking people in poor areas in America, and started asking questions of people on the streets, and they said, "You're not going to understand anything just asking us these questions. Come and live with us. Come and do what we do. Come and see what we do." So he ended up joining a gang. As they all knew he was a researcher, but he followed the gang round. He basically became friends with the leader of the gang, and spent time with them for 8 years, various different members of the gang, and seeing what they were doing. And there was one particular time where the gang leader said, right, today, Venkatesh, you're going to make all the decisions to really see what it's like. So he was actually gang leader for a day, but they knew he was a researcher. He wasn't undercover. So those are two examples. I want you to try and bear those in mind. Obviously make some notes of those now, and then we'll put those kind of into practice when we look at the strengths and weaknesses. When we're considering the practical issues around participant observation, whether it's covert or overt, there's a few phrases you need to be aware of. Those are getting in, the initial, how do you actually get involved in the group? How do you actually join in with what they're doing? The staying in, so the maintaining of that participation, and the getting out as well. It's really important that you can leave the group in a practical way without doing damage and causing some issues. So there's three issues there that you've got to be aware of, and generally they take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money. This method is really quite impractical, really quite weak on the practical front. So for example, McIntyre, he was going in covertly. So he was trying to become part of this Chelsea headhunters gang covertly, which basically means he's got to somehow find a way in without telling them that he wants to do research. Very, very difficult. He rented a car, he rented a flat, he bought new clothes, he got a tattoo, he had to spend a lot of money and a lot of time just to even have a conversation with these guys in a way that didn't arouse suspicion. And so that practically very difficult to get in. Staying in, obviously, he had to kind of pretend that he was a drug dealer, and it costs money. The longer that you're in the group, it costs money to finance. So some issues there. Venkatesh, who was covert, it was probably slightly easier in terms of getting in terms of cost and time. It was dodgy because they thought he was a rival drug gang member. So they basically held him hostage for like 24 hours while they checked out whether his story was true. So that's probably more of an ethical issue than it's practical. But he basically started just trying to talk to them, introducing himself as a sociologist, and they eventually let him in. But his research took 8 years. So we're talking about a very long period of time here. Lots of effort, and again, funding. You need money to sustain research for that long. So practically speaking, these are quite weak. The one saving grace, practically speaking, about participant observation is it might well be the only way you can study these people. Okay, violent football hooligans are not signing up to do interviews or questionnaires or experiments. And same with drug gangs, drug dealing gangs. They're not going to do that because they'll suspect it as being a police operation. They will be suspicious of it and expect it to be something that causes them trouble. So participant observation, actually joining in, being accepted by them joining in, might well be the only way that you can study these guys. Now, ethically speaking, there's quite a lot of ethical issues too. Covert is probably the least ethical method that there is that we're going to look at. Deception, obviously from the start, the whole point is that they don't know who you are, that you're going undercover. So from the start, you're lying about who you are. There's no informed consent because they don't know you're doing the research. Now the trade-off later will be validity, but ethically speaking, it's really low. McIntyre was deceiving the entire gang, and there were instances where he had to join in with violence or potentially be at risk of violence himself, be a victim of violence. So we've got the issue of protection from harm. That's a major ethical factor depending on the group that you're trying to join in with, depending on the research. Now, on the overt side, with Venkatesh, on the overt, where it was obvious he was doing the research, you're not deceiving the participants. Okay, they know you're a researcher, they know what you're there for, and you can therefore get consent. You still might have issues from protection from harm. You still have to be careful about publishing your data with anonymity, keeping it anonymous, because these people can go to prison for your research, and that actually is unethical. And there might well be problem. There was one researcher who published his results under a fake name because he was worried the gang were going to find him. He was looking at a Glaswegian street gang. He didn't ever publish, reveal his true name, his true identity, because he was afraid of the repercussions. So protection from harm, not just for the people, the participants involved, but for the researcher themselves, is a key factor here. So in terms of reliability and validity, remember, reliability is all about how easily replicated, how easy it is to repeat in the exact same way. Validity is all about truth and accuracy, and how accurate is the data. In terms of reliability, what we've got actually is really quite low in reliability. You're joining in with usually quite a niche group, an unusual group, not kind of behaving the way that most normal people do. And that means it's going to be virtually impossible for someone to do the exact same thing that you've done in the exact same way. So it's really quite low in reliability. Validity, though, is where things pick up. The kind of headline idea of why participant observation is done is for the validity side of it. Covertly, you've got really high level of validity. Okay, you're with these guys for years most of the time. You're spending a lot of time with them, doing what they do, seeing the world the way they see it, spending a lot of time with them. You get a real insight into what they think and what they feel, and therefore what they do. So really quite high in validity, probably the highest validity in terms of a method. It's the most valid. And because when you do it covertly, they don't know that you're behaving, that you're researching them. There's no Hawthorne effect. You are just one of the gang. So they behave exactly how they would every day, in a completely natural, real world way. That's what you get. You know Hawthorne effect. So again, really high validity. This is exactly how they would act if you weren't there. And you're getting a lot of insight, a lot of detail, a lot of depth to the data. So McIntyre, like we said, he pretended to be a drug dealer, and that means that these guys behave the way they would normally behave. The flaw with covert is because you're undercover, you can't let anybody know that you're researching them. That means you can't take notes. You can't sit there and ask like stupid questions. So why are we starting a fight with this person? You've got to be quite sneaky about it. Now, there was one guy who went undercover as like the accountant or something like that. I think it was, can't remember now. Who then had a way of, an excuse for making notes essentially, and that's how they got around that. But most of the time, you're going undercover. You have to rely on your memory, and you have to recall events that took place maybe sometimes months or even years ago before you can actually write about it. And memory actually is not that reliable. It gets distorted, particularly when we're talking about the kind of events that these guys would be going through, violent acts, extreme situations. Your memory can get easily distorted. So that can be one way that the validity is affected in a negative way. Now, when it comes to overt, we've got some of the opposites here. They kind of pair up again. You are spending a long time, you get a high level of insight, the Verstehen is there. So in terms of that one, it's the same for covert and overt. But with overt, they know they're being researched. They know they're being watched by an outsider. And that means there's the Hawthorne effect. Now, you've got a drug gang who know they're being researched. Are they going to show you absolutely every part of their operation, how they normally behave? Chances are they won't. They know they're being watched, they know they're being researched, so they're going to only show you the bits they want you to see. And that lowers the validity. But, flip around the memory thing, strength of overt instead of covert is you can take notes. Because they know you're doing research. It doesn't matter if you've got a tape recorder or you're writing stuff down, and you can ask what's called naive questions. So the guy I told you about, the guy doing research with the Scottish gangs, the Glaswegian gang, he spent the first I think it was the first couple of weeks not saying anything because he didn't want to ask what the language was, what the slang meant, because it would give him away. So he couldn't ask naive questions. He was undercover. Venkatesh can ask all the naive questions he wants. And that means he's potentially getting a better understanding of what's going on and increasing the validity. All right, finally then we got representativeness and theoretical issues. Now, covert or overt doesn't really affect representativeness. The fact that it's a participant observation means you've got a very small sample, okay? McIntyre, you're talking about 20 guys. With the drug gang in Venkatesh, there was more people involved, but they're so far removed from normal life because they're usually, participant observation just done on a unique or unusual group, tending to be, criminal or certainly deviant, and not like the rest of society. So it's very low in representativeness, generally speaking. In terms of theoretical approach, again, I'm going to do an entire lesson on this so that it makes more sense and you can go back and think about the different methods. But interpretivists would value this participant observation. You get a high level of Verstehen. You really get insight into the meanings that participants have, the way that they think, and that's really important for interpretivists. I'll explain why in a future lesson. But because it's the kind of most valid method, they really find value in that. Positivists don't find value in it. It's not scientific. It's completely unreliable. Nobody, you can't replicate it. You can't do it the same. You can't prove, test the results and prove that they're good and reliable. And it's also very subjective. It's one person or a couple of people's, the researchers' view and interpretations of what the other people think. That's incredibly subjective. If I research one gang and then you research one gang, we might come away with a very different understanding of what that gang was all about. So positivists don't find it useful at all. And speaking of gangs, actually, it reminds me of the day I met my wife. Actually, she was in a gang, and I was a police officer at the time. And I walked up to her and I said, if being sexy was a crime, you'd be locked away for the rest of your life. That's how I met my wife. Okay, that's everything with participant observation. Make sure you've got a decent set of notes with those two key examples. Next time we'll be looking at non-participant observation to see how they're different.